All right, so thank you everybody for joining us for today's special session in partnership with LebNet. Today our focus is on entrepreneurship and we have a very special guest, Mr. Magid Abraham is going to be talking to us about We Wins Over I in Winning Startups. We are very pleased to have you with us and I would like to go over your bio before I give you the floor to start with your talk. So Dr. Magid Abraham is founder and CEO of Neurawell Therapeutics, a pharmaceutical company developing mental health treatments. He is also chairman of Crimson Capital, a private investment company. He was founding CEO of ComScore for 14 years, which he took public in 2007, focusing on innovation and industry leadership. He was founder and CEO of Paragrant Technologies, producing CRM systems. He was president of IRI, a major international research company, which he led through sustained growth and innovation. He became a visiting scholar at Stanford in 2016, where he taught for 3 years at the Graduate School of Business. He serves on a number of commercial and institutional boards. Dr. Abraham is a world expert on consumer and market measurement and analytics. He has authored seminal award-winning articles. He received the Advertising Research Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award. He earned the AMA's Perlin Award and MIT's Buckweaver Award, both in recognition for lifetime contributions and leadership in the theory and practice of marketing science. He was named EY Entrepreneur of the Year and inducted in the Entrepreneurship Hall of Fame and designated Technology Pioneer by the World Economic Forum. Dr. Abraham received a PhD and an MBA from MIT and is an engineer of the École Polytechnique France. So thank you again for being with us. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mona, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm looking forward to have a discussion on this talk. The genesis of it is Dr. Khoury was in Silicon Valley about a year ago. We were having a conversation about the status of Lebanese entrepreneurships and what are some of the obstacles that people feel. And one of the issues that brought up is that there seems to be a lot of individualism and a lot of notion that a person who comes up with a great idea, who's really smart, has what it takes to build a great company, and that in a lot of cases, there isn't sufficient awareness that it really takes a big orchestra of people to contribute to build the company. And he really liked the subject and wanted me to talk about it. In fact, I was supposed to come to Beirut and talk about it. It never really worked out. So I'm glad we're finally discussing it today. And I will start with a few slides just to frame the conversation. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll obviously, I don't think the slide will take too long, and then we can open up to questions and answers. So let me just share the screen. Let's see, do you guys see it? Do you guys see the slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So the topic here is somewhat of an ethereal topic, but I think it is very important in anchoring a company's or a startup's culture, which is the culture or the demeanor of the founder. Is it an I culture or a we culture? And my thesis, as the title would say here, is that the teams that adopt we in their mode of operation every day, in the way they speak, in the way they represent their companies, and the way they talk about what they're doing, the people who use we are the people who represent companies that have a bigger chance of winning. And, so at first glance, it may be it may be a question of why do we really care about that? Isn't that a grammatical question? I mean, it depends on the subject. If I'm talking about myself, I say I, and if I'm talking about a group, I say we, and it's very simple. Well, that is grammatically correct, but when you are talking about a group, and it is socially and morally less so. So just give you an example. Let's go back to World War II and imagine that we have two soldiers. Johnny is an American Marine who participated in the Battle of Okinawa. He says, I fought in Okinawa and I defeated the Japanese soldiers that were firing at me. And we eventually took the islands. So that's one statement. Another guy is an Air Force pilot. He actually piloted a B-29 Super Fortress. It's kind of the equivalent of a B-52. Throws away a lot of bombs, makes a lot of destructions. So he said, I relentlessly bombed the Japanese and I won the war against Japan. So who do you believe? There are two guys that are making statements about their experience. Do you believe the first guy, or do you believe the second guy that claimed he won the war against Japan? Well, in reality, it is probably the case that the second guy had more of an impact. He probably rained a lot more destruction over Japan, so his contribution to winning the war, as individual as it is, was bigger than the first guy. But just by the mere fact that he's taking a credit that belongs to millions of soldiers, commanders, engineers, people who produced the weapons, people who produced all the nutrition that the army had to live on. It basically tells you that this guy has a big ego. He's self-centered. And then the question is, let's suppose that later in life he starts a company. Would you work for him? Probably not, because he will minimize your contribution. He will take the credit for himself, and you're not going to be happy working for him. And generally speaking, beyond this contrived example, the tension between I and we is the tension between the individual and the group. And it is a tension that defines identity, accomplishments, and group ownership. And in particular, it happens a lot in business and especially in startups. Why? Because startups have founders or have CEOs, and they think that they started the company, they built it, they are very it comes to them very easily to talk in the I pronoun, but in fact over time the impact on the company is pretty pernicious.
Dr. Abraham, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we had an overlaying thing on your screen, but I think it's fine now. If you just want to make it full screen, so go to present mode so we do not have that problem again. Thank you.
Okay, so what do you see now? Do you see the PowerPoint screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Now it's fine.
And do you see the pictures on the screen or just the PowerPoint?
Yes, we see Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs, okay. So a big contributing factor to all of this is what I call the lone genius myth. And Steve Jobs is the universal embodiment of this genius that creates this incredibly successful company. It eventually becomes the most valuable company in the world. His name is associated with all kinds of innovations, and everybody he's elevated to the point of worship by some people. But in fact, if you look at Steve's career, when he started Apple, their first product was the Apple II, and it was a very nice technical product. They did a lot of programming, a lot of innovation in terms of operating system and all kinds of stuff. But the reality is that Steve never wrote a line of code. He just was not a programmer. He had a knack for design. He could react to something that you give you. He can think about it. He can give you ideas for improvement. He can talk about user interface. He had a very good knack for the user, what the market would accept for the user interface. But the reality is that he's not a technical person. He actually, to make Apple successful, he had Steve Wozniak being his partner, and together they made Apple. Could he have succeeded without Steve Wozniak? Well, he would have needed somebody else. But the reality is that if you say I am Apple, that wouldn't be correct, because that would be taking the role of Steve Wozniak away. When he built the Macintosh, he basically built one of the best first-class teams in terms of software development in the world. These people worked really hard. In fact, the basic idea for the Macintosh came from Xerox, and they licensed it. Now, they made it a great product. They were very masterful at marketing it, and Steve played a huge role in that. But there again, it was a team effort. And then the product that's kind of the most famously associated with Steve Jobs is the iPhone. It's probably the most influential technical product that he worked on, and probably has been developed in the last, I don't know, 30 years. Well, would it surprise you to know that actually Steve Jobs was opposed to the creation of the iPhone? The story of the iPhone is that there was a team within Apple that was basically working on the secret project for about 2 years, developing the software, developing the multi-touch interface. Then they finally got to show their prototype to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs turned it down. And they spent a lot of time working through the leadership team, having meetings with Steve. And Steve's objection was, I'm not sure about the market. I'm not sure I like the phone market. He was persistent in terms of turning it down. And then finally, the leader of the team spent all night writing a memo, sent it to Steve, and I guess it was a very effective memo that Steve called him to his office, spent about 8 hours in his office debating together whether they should offer the iPhone or not. And then the outcome of the meeting is that Steve relented and decided to support it. So he was not the idea man behind the iPhone. He actually, from a business standpoint, initially rejected it. It took someone who was very visionary, leader of a group, to convince him that that is a good product to invest in. And the rest is history. Steve adopted it and pushed it and made it a huge success, and it became the iconic line of products that it is today. But despite his genius, on this particular issue, he made a mistake, and it took another genius to correct what he was talking about. The other factor is a great idea myth. So a lot of people think that, well, if I have a great idea, I mean, all great companies originate with a great idea, and if I have a great idea, then I am 60%, 70% of the way there. And actually, if I came up with a great idea, don't I deserve to claim credit for it? Don't I deserve to say it's my idea? Well, first of all, a great idea is important. There's no doubt. The better the idea, generally speaking, the better off the chances of the business are to succeed. But I will tell you that an idea is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for a business to succeed. Why? Because you find in a lot of cases, businesses can start with a mediocre idea and then they improve it. And what it takes is the team to basically work with that idea, learn from the market reaction, and then re-engineer the idea, reposition it to take advantage of the signals that they're getting. And then it goes from a so-so idea to a good idea, or maybe even a great idea. On the other hand, you could also have a really great idea, but you can give it to a founding team that is really obsessed with that idea, just is obstinately pursuing it, does not take any feedback or any signal, and they eventually drive the idea into the ground. It is you probably heard the adage that VCs don't invest in great ideas, they invest in great people. And there are probably lots of articles that you could read about that. And while I can't vouch for that statement is 100% true, if you really have a great idea, and if you are a credible, although limited entrepreneur in some fashion for that idea, you'll probably get funded. But for the most part, entrepreneurs, investors are really looking for people that have the experience, have the resilience, have the maturity to react to something, take advantage of it, constantly improve it. They also know that most startup successes, in fact, 75% of startups eventually pivot. So they start with an idea, they work on it for a year or two, they get limited traction, they're frustrated, and eventually they come up with something different, either a tweak to the idea or repositioning or something sometimes that's diametrically opposed. But they somehow take their skill set and what they've learned and where they've started from, and then they eventually modify the idea to make it work. PayPal is a good example of a company that pivoted 5 times before it became a big company. They started with what seemed to be a very big idea. I don't know if you have ever seen the phones of the 1990s or the early 2000s. They're kind of small Motorola flip phones or whatever. And their idea was to create an application for those systems to administer payments. Well, that really didn't work. Then they said, well, if it doesn't work on mobile, maybe we should do it on a smartphone, like the Palm Pilot, which is kind of like the original smartphone. Well, that didn't work. Then they said, well, let's do it by email. Well, that didn't work. And then eventually they stumbled on this idea that if they made it a preferred payment system with independent merchants, between customers and independent merchants that don't know each other, that have a reputation, that there is a reputation gap, then that will serve a function. And that took off. It took off within the eBay sellers community. And it was such a success that eBay stepped in and paid $1.5 billion for it. But it was a bunch of close calls. There were, just to give you an idea, the PayPal team there is a name for them. It's called the PayPal Mafia. These people basically have gone from creating PayPal to creating all kinds of great companies. So you have people like Elon Musk, and you have people like the guy who founded LinkedIn. You have Peter Thiel. You have a lot of billionaires that basically started out of the 5 or 6 people that created PayPal, and actually probably the dozen people that were early employees. They just proved to be just an outstanding team, almost unparalleled team. And yet they had to pivot 5 times to get to the right idea. So what does that tell you? It tells you that, well, their first idea may have felt like a great idea, but it really wasn't, because they had to change it. And it may have told you that the next iterations may have been great ideas, but it took a lot of trial and error. It took a lot of listening. And it took a lot of courage. At some point, Peter Thiel, after they had invested 2 years developing an application for the Palm Pilot, he decided to scrap it. Just cold turkey, stop it, don't work on it. And the board was all over him for doing that. And he basically said, look, if that's not an important thing for us and we need to do something else, let's focus on that something else and cut the umbilical cord. And the rest is history. So what I would say is that ideas, a good idea is important, but it actually takes a team, a group of people that will ultimately guide that initial idea into something that succeeds. And it is that process, that adaptation process, that eventually is responsible for success, more so than the formulation of the initial idea. And so if you're the author of the initial great idea, chances are it's not the idea that would lead your company to success. It's a modified version of it or a new version of it. And lots of people contributed to that. And therefore, it is really important to keep in mind that the I is not necessarily a great representation of the credit that goes for the creation of the company. Here's a chart that talks about the reasons for startup failures. And by the way, failures among startups are very sobering. Really, only 1 in 10 startups will typically succeed. So if you look at the reasons, the biggest reason is lack of product market fit. So it's really, you came up with an idea, you created a good prototype, a good technical solution. It may have been a brilliant technical solution, but then when it comes to the market, it doesn't work, it doesn't gain traction. The second is marketing problems. It may have good market fit, but to get the word out, to get customers to know about it, to get customers to try it, you just didn't really solve the problems that are needed to basically get the reach and the scale that allow you to get people to appreciate the idea. The third problem is team problems. That's usually when you have conflicts among key people in the company, whether within the founding team or whether among sort of the first line of executives, or eventually you may have cultural problems or morale problems, but that could also sink a company. Only 16% of the cases are finance problems. And to some extent, it's very hard to separate finance problems from the product and market fit and marketing success. If you have good success there, chances are you'll always find an investor to put in extra added money. But there could be also the way the finances are managed and how costs are being run and the discipline and all of that. So, but nevertheless, only 1 in 6 is really driven by finance. And then only 6% are tech problems, 2% are operational problems. So this is particularly important for engineering students. So look at this chart. Engineers tend to look at, the key to make the company successful is to build the product. Well, that is definitely true. You can't build the products without engineers. But ultimately, you can build a product, and the key is to make sure that there are people that are going to buy it. Make sure you know how to market it. Make sure that you gain customers. As elegant as a technical solution might be, and as robust or solid the foundation is, ultimately it is the market that's going to decide. So this also has implications for your founding team. If you really think about it, um, it is very, very important since product market fit and marketing are really the majority of the reasons for failure. It is really important to have among the founding team somebody who has good skills, good intuition, good experience in assessing that, in understanding the user base, in understanding how they behave, in understanding the competition, in understanding what's going to take to basically get people aware of your product and give them a reason to value it and deliver value. So yes, you do need a technical founder, but you also, to have a complete team, you really need to address both sides of the equation. The technical founder is an enabler. You need to get to a product, but ultimately it is rarely the case that that's the key reason for a product failing. This also basically says this cannot be the job of one person. No person can say I about this, because you have all these different functions that are contributing to the company's success, and if they're contributing to the company's success or failure, it really the credit has to be distributed among the team that's responsible for it. And those people feel like they own the product, they own the venture, just like anybody else. At least psychologically, they need to feel that this is theirs. This is not, they're not just following um, somebody's instructions. So if you're a founder, the first transition between an I and a we is the founding team. And usually it's not, I mean, this is a picture of the early Microsoft. I'm sure all these people were brilliant, but the two key founders there are Bill Gates and Alan. And, those were they were both actually very technically skilled, but they were also shrewd from a business standpoint. And we'll actually talk in a little bit about what actually made Microsoft take off, and what is a skill that well beyond the initial sort of technical know-how that actually made Microsoft as big as it is. But those people in the founding team, they represent a diverse skill set. Some may be more market-oriented, some may be more technical-oriented. They need to feel like a cohesive unit. They need to feel like they have a sense of ownership. They need to feel that they're respected. They really need to feel that they are part of the we. And they get very encouraged when their leader speaks about their company in terms of we rather than I, and you guys are a bunch of sheep and you don't matter. The second one is probably surprising for a lot of people. Your next expansion, the next very critical ingredient in your success is investors. So investors are typically viewed as having a different set of objectives. People kind of sometimes dismissively look at them as, well, they're in it for the money. Well, yes, they are in it for the money, but think about investors as they are the people who write the first check, and in a way, they validate your venture. They validate your venture because they are experienced, they're not throwing money away, they have done their due diligence. They may actually, during the pitch process or the investment process, kind of take your idea or your business plan, help you refine it, help you get to a point where some professional people who have invested in a lot of other companies are willing to write a check and support you. And from that point, they are really your partners. Because at the end of the day, if they want to make money, they want the company to be big, to grow, to become profitable, to succeed, which means that um, they share the ultimate the ultimate objective um, as you do. Now, uh, their financial interests are not totally aligned, but they're 80 or not. For successful companies, they are totally aligned. For for companies that are having trouble, and then where there are dynamics between preferred and common stock, uh, those are companies where there may be some differences between investors and founders. But early investors are not only people who have shown that they believe in you, but they can act as a promoters for your company. When they are talking to their colleagues, when they are talking in industry forums, or when they put your name on their website, they are lending you the credibility of their brand and helping you become more known. They talk about the promise of the company. They talk about the skills of the founding team. They talk to their colleagues. They're trying to stimulate interest in new investors joining so that next time the company needs money, there is money to be found, and there are other people that want to invest. And in fact, I think one of the biggest values in the US, if if I had a company that's let's say funded in, let's take my case, ComScore was started in Washington D.C. Lots of startups get started in lots of startups get started in Silicon Valley. There are a lot of advantages for being in Washington D.C., but one of the big disadvantages is that if you are supported by an investor group in Silicon Valley, you have a buzz that gets created by those investors that go around and talk to you and meet every day, and they're talking about the latest and greatest and what they're doing, and et cetera, et cetera. And there is a lot of PR, kind of unearned PR, free PR that comes just from your investors, showing pride in the company that they have supported, being interested in having other investors wanting to join the fray and invest in the future of the company. So that creates a lot of value, because ultimately it filters out and becomes part of your marketing. It becomes part of your marketing appeal. If you're viewed as a hot company, then that can help you market your product ultimately to consumers. Investors also have a lot of experience. They have seen a lot of companies succeed or fail. They have a lot of relationships. If you're stuck on a marketing problem, they may have a contact. If you need to hire a key person, they may have a contact. If you need expert legal advice, they may have contacts. So there is just a whole bunch of experience they bring to the party that will also make it part of the team. And so I really think of investors as not an us versus them kind of group. It could turn into an us versus them, but usually that's bad news. That's basically when the company's in trouble. But when the company is delivering and they have the faith that the company will succeed, they are one of your best partners, and they are part of the we. The other uh, the other partners in the we are your board of directors. The board of directors could be investors, but they could be independent experts, or it could be experts who you have known, have been mentors to you in the past, and they're there. They're the ultimate authority in terms of running the company. Um, However, what I would tell you is that board of directors have a a a great disposition to work in consensus. In fact, it's very, very, very rare that a board of directors will approve a resolution that is not by unanimous consent. They go they go a long way towards when there is a debate and then there are ideas back and forth on a particular issue to eventually reach consensus and speak in one voice. And the board of directors has a fiduciary responsibility that the company succeeds. Now, they may have separate interests. Their interests are not perfectly aligned depending on who they represent. But ultimately, they have, at least in a Western economy, they have a legal obligation to represent the company and the shareholders of the company, all shareholders, not just investing shareholders, and they have liability if they actually don't do that. But they're usually working not because of the liability. Liability comes when things are not going well. They usually work because they're excited about the company. They feel like they can guide it, they can contribute to their success, and they can share in that success. So sometimes companies look at the board as kind of a nuisance who have to present to them. We have to get their go along. I think to some extent they're kind of like your professor. You have to basically make your case, and it will get debated, and you will get feedback. Sometimes may not be exactly the feedback that you sought, but it's very important in dealing with a board that egos are checked aside, and there is a very objective, partnership-oriented dialogue that can lead the board to be an essential part of the team and to help you succeed. And they are really a big part of your win. The last, one of the other key things is customers. So you don't think of customers as part of your. They're not founders. They're not part of your founding team. Why are they so important? Well, obviously, at the end, they are very important because they're responsible for your revenue. That's how you grow. That's how you accumulate value. But early customers in particular are very, very important for giving you the break that you need to take off. So in here, I'm using the example of Microsoft, which, everybody thinks of Bill Gates as this genius entrepreneur, and Microsoft just created this wonderful business that is one of the most valuable in the world. For a long time, it was the most valuable company in the world. But in reality, Microsoft got started and did reasonably well at the beginning. But all they were doing is they were basically developing the basic language. So they were developing a language that can be used for not highly technical people, that has some flexibility, but that's basically what they were developing. And it wasn't even the best language you could develop. So their big break came in 1980, I think 1980 or 1982, when IBM decided they want to introduce a personal computer. And they thought it was easier for having somebody else develop it because the only operating system that IBM had developed up to this point is the System 360 and System 370. So eventually, they gave the contract to Microsoft. And the rest is history. Microsoft rode on the wave of the IBM PC and then the IBM PC clones. And it became, and because of the IBM name, they became a monopoly because pretty much the IBM PC and its clones had 90% of the market. And so Microsoft got 90% of the operating system market. And then eventually they replaced MS-DOS with Windows, and they maintained that advantage for a long time. So now think about that. You could really legitimately say that IBM in that at that early time made Microsoft. There is a partner at IBM or an executive at IBM that Microsoft somehow did a good enough job in convincing him to trust the future of a very product line on this young company that is going to develop an operating system and will develop it in his timeline so he can develop the PC. He can introduce the PC and not delay it, and he's not a prisoner to a huge IT organization that only knows how to develop mainframe. So he made a bet. The bet was somewhat successful because he got what he wanted. But ultimately, with the advent of the clones and the commoditization of the IBM PC, it ended up really a big win to Microsoft, and eventually IBM got marginalized. But so if you think about, not everybody necessarily has an IBM, but your first customer is always very important. It's the first customer that will give you a break. It's the first customer that decides to write a check. It's the customer that will give you feedback. It's a champion within your customer that will convince their colleagues that it's worth giving your product a try. In a way, they are lending the credibility of your brand to your brand. If you do well, they become a reference, and they may actually help connect you to other potential customers, or just being a renowned customer in an industry will cause their competitors to wake up and notice what you're doing. And it takes a really special relationship with that first customer. You're not just basically signing up your product, giving it to them, you ship it, and then they deal with it. Most of the time, you really work with them on an implementation. You make sure that they're happy. You make sure that their wish list is implemented. And you take that early feedback and you filter it into the product. And in a way, a lot of the rough edges or some of the very useful features about your product will come from your first customer, your first 4 or 5 customers. You treat them differently, you treat them in a special way, they treat you in a special way, and they are really essential to your success. And ultimately, you really need to think of them as a part of your team. Over time, they may lose that particular distinction, but your customers in general clearly need to feel like they are winning by buying your product. So eventually, customers will grow from a handful of customers who tried your product first to your customer base overall. And it is really important that you think about them when you're trying to take care of the people who are important here. Last thing is employees. I don't need to tell you, employees are the lifeblood of a company. It's really important that employees, particularly for a startup, are believers in the startup. They're not 9-to-5 workers. They do what it takes to get the company to succeed. They work hard at understanding what their mission is. They work hard to do the best they can to improve what they need to do. But what's really critical in all of this is for them to have a sense of ownership, to trust the leadership, to feel like they work in a company that has a lot of transparency. They don't really like a lot of politics. And so companies do this by creating cultures that perpetuates, that takes the belief system of the founding team and then codify it into a set of behavioral principles that they want the employees to follow. And the extent to which employees identify with that and follow it, that will give you a a long-lasting weapon in your struggle for survival and for success, and will help perpetuate the degree of excellence that started with the founding team when you are starting to hire dozens and dozens or eventually hundreds or thousands of employees. So employees are also part of your team. One of the big issues that I think motivates, creates creates a problem, particularly in Lebanon, is the anxiety that's represented in this picture, which is, do you trust your partners? Do you trust your investors? Do you trust your team members? Do you trust the lawyers? Do you trust the government? And I have a lot of empathy with the process of starting something in Lebanon, because let's face it, the track record is not great. Trust is not necessarily institutional in Lebanon, and it can really stand in the way of making big steps and eventually succeeding. I remember 10 years ago, I was part of a delegation that was sponsored by the U.S. State Department to visit the region and talk to, talk about entrepreneurship and meet with entrepreneurs and see how the U.S. could be helpful. And I remember one meeting where I saw this guy in Lebanon who had developed a really very clever system. It's a solution that works well in construction, and it was something that grew out of trying to optimize his needs, but it was a really clever solution that delivered a lot of value to any construction project. Now, he was selling it in the Gulf countries, and it was very clear looking at it that this is the type of company that could have global market potential. Real estate or construction is a big business globally. It's not just in the Middle East, and this seems to be an excellent product. So I said, well, you really have the potential to play on the global scene. He said, well, yeah, but I need capital to do it. Why not talk to VCs? He said, I don't trust them. All they want is take over the company and fire me. And that was a very eloquent statement about the mindset of how many entrepreneurs feel, and how there is this gap of trust between the people who are necessary to help you scale and succeed and make it in a big way. And it's kind of too bad, because I'm sure his product could have succeeded on a global scale, but I'm sure he's also still a small business working in the Gulf countries. There is also a personal aspect of this, a personal aspect and a leadership style aspect. So here are two historical leaders. I chose them because they personify the types of the whether they actually use the we or the I in their leadership style. So here's Churchill. He was Britain was on the verge of defeat in 1940. He wanted to motivate his people to rise to the occasion, to not psychologically surrender to the German juggernaut. So he made his famous speech, which is typical of the way he spoke, which is that we will fight them on the beaches, we will find them on the landing hills, we will find them in the streets. We shall never surrender. He did not say, I will fight them. He did not say, I will never surrender. It was a we. It was kind of the British people that he was talking about. Mussolini, likes to talk about himself, like to talk about fascism. One of his biggest quotes is um, I like to have an extraordinary life. So he was very well into himself. And, I will leave it up to you to decide who is a better leader. But if you take it personally, let's suppose that you have a family. Which is better to say? Is it better to say my house or is it better to say our house? Is it better to say my vacation or is it better to say our vacation? Is it better to say my memories or our memories? But think about it if you also own a business. Is it better to say my company or our company? Is it better to say my balance sheet or our balance sheet? Think about what each form of statement would mean and what kind of person it says you are simply by the pronoun that you use. So at the end of the day, the picture of what it takes to make a company succeed has multiple layers. And that's really what is necessary to make that success a reality. And the I is only a starting point near the center. It's a small starting point. And it takes a combination of a great founding team, good, good, smart investors, a, a, a perceptive and a helpful board of directors, um, customers who take a chance on your product and eventually vote with their checkbook, and employees who um, who take your initial idea and make it into a long-term surviving entity. And so, for all these reasons, um, I think it might be good advice to say, let's just lose the I in the way we talk in business, in person. It's just always better to and a better show of character to lose the I and use the we. And that's my presentation. I'll be happy to stop and take questions.
Great. Honestly, for me, it was more than amazing. I really loved how you touched upon the various myths that we encounter as well in our entrepreneurship courses and when young students actually believe in them, but after some time they will definitely agree with you and start seeing what you're talking about more and understand it better. So guys, now it's the time for our audience to interact with our speaker and ask questions. So who would like to go first? You can either raise your hand and we will call your name. All right, Ali?
I don't have a question necessarily, but I just wanted to touch on the same topic within the same umbrella because Miss Mona said something like in our first meeting, I believe, that really helped me personally, where she said, "It's you are no longer yourself when you're part of the team. You represent the whole startup. Like whenever you speak, she's saying this in regards to like people who have nervousness when they speak or whatever the case was. She said it's no longer about you. It's about what your team that you represent. So I just want to say that like it ties in together very nicely with this from a different perspective, from a neighboring perspective.
Well, that's
I
great.
heard that. Okay, it was a bit not very clear, the noise, but all right, so good. Thank you, Ali. Who would like to ask a question for Dr. Abraham?
I like to talk. Yeah, no, I'm kidding. Uh, so yes, usually I'm chatty, and my name is Shadi. So probably there's a correlation over there. I just okay. So all throughout this session, we saw the different flavors of using we versus using I. I just have a question on How did your experience in a CRM company affect your thought about the we mentality?
I think I acquired that mindset very early on. Um, I mean, I think that the first company I joined, I was critical in turning it around, but it wasn't my company or my idea. But I was an employee that uh, actually from uh, early on, I sort of always behaved in any place I worked as an owner. I would basically evaluate, is this something I should be working on or not? Well, I could ask somebody, or I could basically evaluate it myself. If I was an owner, would I do this, or what would be the right thing to do? And obviously, it takes belief. If you want to be an owner, you're gonna feel like you're treated like an owner, or you want to feel like it's something that's good owning. Um, but but so so you recognize that I was very quickly in front of customers, and when you talk to customers, you can't say I. I is just like the death now. So the closer you are actually doing, I mean, I was actually kind of wearing the hat of a product developer, but I also was a champion for the product, so I did all the early sales. And you learn very quickly that you don't go very far with I. So it just became we. And I suppose my parents instilled in me the royal we, that it's always the, the royal we is not something that just royals would do. It gives you actually more stature or more credibility to say we instead of I. So I is really is really uh, not the best way to use anyway.
A funny anecdote. Once I lost around 10 grades on paper because I used because I used B. I feel that I explored with the professor the topic. She told me, "You are not a king," but no, I am a king. It's okay.
You said Isaac. Well, clearly it depends on the circumstance, but definitely in business, the royal we helps. Plus, the other thing is that when you say we, people have the impression that you have an organization behind you, you have a group behind you. It's bigger. So from a perception standpoint, not only it reflects well on you as being somebody who's not just uh, monopolizing credit, but it also says there is an organization behind you, so people take you more seriously.
Oh, nice, nice. That's a very nice view of the word we.
Yeah. And then if you
Thank you.
get married and you say my house, you you will you will know it very quickly.
Yes.
Exactly. Ali, do you have another question?
Yeah, first of all, is my microphone better now? If it's not, I'll type it.
Yes, it's better.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, this isn't personally applicable for our startup, but for companies in general that need a mascot, like how Steve Jobs was for Apple. Don't you think in that case the use of the I is important to like denote a figurehead?
Um, well, you know, it is important that you have a leader that you respect and you identify with. But that leader has to treat you like you're part of his team. One of the things that was great about Steve Jobs is that he convinced people, he almost brainwashed them into you. If you join Apple, you will create these insanely great products that are going to change the world. And literally, people felt that, and that was part of their identity, and they felt like he was the embodiment of that. So they all looked up to him. Uh, but but I think when he spoke about things that they have done, he would say, we at Apple, or he would say Apple. He would not say Steve Jobs. Now, he has grown because of his accomplishments and his reputation and his marketing skills to be viewed as, to be rightly viewed as the face of Apple and the flag of Apple. But listen to his presentations. It's always Apple. It's always we did.
And if I may say, like this leadership and this praise from others wouldn't come if somebody would just keep on praising themselves. It's just natural. So they have really deserved this position of leadership without them having everything revolve around them. So it's something that people would give somebody else, and not if I call myself I all the time and attribute all the successes to myself, doesn't mean that people will have more respect for me now.
Yeah, leadership is not something you declare, it's something that's conferred on you.
Exactly. So who would also like to ask a question to our speaker?
All right, I must be incredibly persuasive or incredibly boring, one of the two.
I think
I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you suggest startups should do if they start losing motivation or they feel like they're getting nowhere? Like, what do you think is something that could like lift them up?
Well, we talked a lot about, I mean, that happens to a lot of companies. I mean, remember the statistics? I think that was the study by the École Polytechnique de Lausanne. They came up with a statistic of 75% of companies eventually must do a pivot. So to some extent, it really happens to a lot of companies because you know that you feel like what you're initially doing is not working. And so sort of the question becomes, is there a pivot that would make you more successful? And you have to sort of think about, don't really think about your contribution as a particular product or a particular method. Think of it as a goal or an objective or a solution to a problem. And then try to think about, is there some way you can re-engineer, you can put pieces, you can switch pieces around, you can add pieces, you can drop pieces. You just have to iterate to see if another embodiment of the initial idea is a better fit. And I think having outside professionals, either investors or board of directors, can help quite a bit in that. They're not necessarily going to tell you how to pivot, although sometimes they would suggest it, but they will give you feedback on whether that pivot is likely to succeed or not. And they will help you sort of filter out the losing ideas from the potential winning ideas. Nobody can guarantee that an idea is eventually winning, but a lot of people will help you if an idea will lose. So I think that that's kind of one of the very first things that you should try. If at the end of the day you feel like a pivot is really not workable, then you should really face the question of, do we make a mistake? And there is, I think, being dedication and perseverance are wonderful values for people, but sometimes people can push them to the extreme of being stubborn and not just basically learning from the experience and moving on. I mean, remember, 9 out of 10 startups eventually fail. Now, the good entrepreneurs, if you fail, if you're part of the 9 out of 10, if you're a good entrepreneur, you learn from it and you do something different. And eventually you'll get your shot at success. It's really that sense of adaptability, the sense of resilience that will basically say, let me focus on the good. I will remember the bad, but let me just really distill the good that I have learned, and can I build on it? That is really important.
So we have one question from the chat. Thank you, Zain. Kathy Frali is asking, what do you really mean by investing in people? And if you could collaborate on this point a bit more.
So VCs will tell you they don't really invest in great ideas. They really look at the team that's coming behind the idea, and they evaluate, is this a team that I have the confidence that they can execute on the idea, number one, but they have the experience and the resilience to basically recognize when this idea is not necessarily working, which chances are the first idea is going to need some iteration. So are they mature enough? Are they diverse enough to be able to take an idea and do what it takes to make it successful, rather than think of themselves as prisoners of the idea. They try to implement it, and they can't survive the first shock, the first market shock. First market shock is almost always it's almost always negative, but it's always instructive. And you know, so VCs are looking for people who are seasoned, who have seen failure before, who have adapted and turned it into a success, who know how to build teams, who have you know, as you saw, the product to market fit is really probably the most important part of a startup. That's the biggest reason for failure. And they need to know that this team will have a good sense of listening to the market and improving the product market fit, and making sure that if the initial thing doesn't work, they can evolve it into something that does work. That's basically what, you know, the first 3 or 4 years of a company's life is always trial and error. You don't launch a rocket and you think that's it, it's going to land, it's going to be successful. You have to modify its trajectory multiple times. Now, so in a lot of cases, there may be a team that has a good idea, but it's kind of immature. They may be either just one-dimensional, they're technical, but they don't really have a clue about what the market dynamics are. How do you market this thing? And what if the VCs really think that this is a good idea, they will try to work with you on complementing your team, or in some cases, if it's not attractive enough, they don't bother. And so even though it may be a really good idea, it becomes really centered on the team that's presenting it and whether that team inspires confidence or not.
Awesome. So we have a question from Jad Farid Assaf.
Hello, thank you for a talk. You were talking about how important a team is for a startup. I wanted to ask, how do you go about finding the right team? It doesn't feel right to just interview someone and just choose him based on his CV and a quick interview. I feel like there should be kind of a process into including someone in your team, maybe start him as an employee and then move on from there. What do you think?
Usually teams are built as a result of long-standing relationships. It's somebody you went to school with, that you know very well what they do, and somebody you've worked with, somebody that you've shared professional interests with, somebody that you know. If it is, you can't interview people as part of your team. Maybe you can interview somebody who's going to play somewhat of a secondary role, but your founding team, the founding team, it has to be organic. It has to be people that know each other really intimately well. They believe in each other. They know what the strengths and weaknesses are. They're also very clear on what the strengths and weaknesses are. They also agree on ultimately who is the leader. It's not 50-50, by the way. I mean, I'm talking about the team, and I'm talking about sharing, and I'm talking about spreading ownership and all that. But 50-50 ownerships don't really work, because eventually you have a difference of opinion and you need a tiebreaker, and you need basically a hierarchy that would say, here is how you can be paralyzed if you have you need a way to force a decision. So usually in a founding team, there needs to be enough maturity to recognize who the leader is and who has that prerogative of being ultimately the decider. Now, hopefully, with a lot of maturity, you just operate like a board. You try to reach consensus, or as close to a consensus as possible. But I don't think, while I do think that you get, by hiring and by observing people and giving them a chance and seeing how well they do, they can move into the inner circle of a equivalent to a founding team. And certainly if you look at Apple and you look at Microsoft and whatever, this senior team grew from people they've hired and have done an excellent job at junior levels, and then they got recognized and promoted pretty fast. But it's just very rare to hire somebody to interview somebody and hire them to be part of your team. It is, you have to do a heck of a lot of due diligence for that to work. Usually teams come already formed, and with an already deep sharing experience, so they trust each other and you can trust them as an investor.
Thank you.
Great. It seems that Ali has a third question, right?
Yeah. Sorry, okay. So what it is basically when you have a team, I often see that it's very easy to start hearing a lot of what you want to hear, like an echo chamber where you just hear the positive reviews. And this is oftentimes what leads to a startup failing, because they don't get the critical response. And I know the answer to that is always keep your ears open to what people are saying and stuff like that. But how do you try to minimize bias? Like, what's an actual concrete way to minimize your own bias when looking for responses?
Well, I personally am always looking. I'm always looking for bad news. If you come to me and you say it's, we have this good news, I'll give you a high five, and then I'll say, okay, so what else is not working? So it's great that this stuff is working, but what else we need to worry about? And I will sort of, when I'm evaluating things, I have a highly tuned antenna for either fake praise or for signals that things are not really working as well as they appear to be, or they're being positioned as they are. And to the extent that you have negative reviews or you have an account loss or whatever, you really dig into that to try to understand why you lost it. You may win 10 clients and you lose one. That should be your red flag. Is that client loss? Is that something that says that has a lesson about the product, or is that just an individual weird case, and it's part of it's part of randomness? But you really need to maintain an eye towards making sure that the feedback is not filtered, and given people's natural tendency to try to tell you the good news, you do want to try to bias it the other way. The other thing is that it's really important to have in your culture the notion that we don't hide bad news. We don't sweep it under the rug. That if there is bad news, that's what I want to hear first, because bad news is what's going to kill us. Good news is great, and we can build on it. But if we can let bad news fester, and if it is really symptomatic of an ongoing problem, you really need to address it, or else you will pay the price for it, and the price sometimes could be pretty bad. But it is important that people feel like they have the permission to talk about bad news, that you're not going to shoot the messenger, that people who report bad news are not considered as complainers or sourpusses. That they are actually somebody who's reporting bad news is somebody who is committed, who has a sense of ownership, who feels that the company needs to be accountable, and is worried about the future and is behaving the way an owner should behave. Not everybody does that, but that should be the way it works.
Okay, thank you.
Very nice approach, but doesn't this introduce the problem of high variance in the work of the company?
High variance, meaning?
Meaning low bias, meaning that we are working on a lot of things, so we might not have enough time to finish everything on time.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't you can't give every problem equal weight. You have to have a judgment that would basically say what's an important problem and what's a problem that you can put as part of the queue that needs to be addressed, but it's not an emergency. There is definitely you need to be cognizant of what your capacity is, and you have to plan according to your capacity. If your capacity is to do certain things and you can do 10 things, but you have 50 things to do, you have to know which 10 things you have to work on. And lots of factors enter into that. It's not just whether it is good news or bad news, but again, the more you have to have a culture that would basically say we recognize bad news, we take it seriously. It is an essential part of my job to identify when things are not working, to make sure that it is known about, and then we'll make a decision on how well we address it, how fast we address it. It may be at the end of the day not important, or it may be something that you will voluntarily take because you're working on something else that is more strategic. There isn't really a hard and fast rule about how do you react to every single issue that comes across your way, but that becomes a matter of prioritization.
Yes, thank you for your answer. And now I realize that my question was a bit theoretical, so I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
So any last questions? Because we're at 7:26. We have like 4 more minutes or 3 more minutes. So
I have a question.
yeah, no.
It's regarding a startup's name. This is kind of more specific. Like my team and I have been brainstorming a lot for like the perfect name that can catch like the attention of our audience and our target market. And we're finding it very hard to find something that's unique, that hasn't been used. Like, is this something that everyone goes through, or are we just stuck at like the simplest thing?
No, naming is definitely very hard. And obviously the temptation is to actually come up with a name that uh, means or reflects the meaning of the business. That's your first temptation. That's the ideal. But what you'll find is that a lot of people basically just come up with a name that is memorable, is easy to spell, is distinctive, but it doesn't say anything to do about what the business is. Think about Apple. Why did they choose Apple? They could have chosen PC or whatever. They chose Apple, and it worked. So at the end of the day, at the end of the day, um, it's good for the name to be suggestive of what the company does, but it's very difficult. And you don't want to create a name that's too complicated that people don't remember, and you have to spend all your time spelling it and all of that. I would, if you're stuck on that, then just think of a cute, memorable name and go with it. And eventually people remember it because of the product that you have, and if you're successful, people remember the name.
Thank you for that, because like we've been trying to, or we kind of want to make like an e-commerce platform in Lebanon for thrifting, and we've been trying to get a word that somewhat symbolizes it and represents it. But today we moved on. We're like, let's just think of something else that's short and catchy, but we didn't know if that was the right thing to do or not. So thank you.
Yeah, I am guilty of trying to come up with, usually trying to come up with a name that means something. So, for example, Neurawell. Neurawell is something neural and then well, so wellness of neural. So, but I've gone through a lot of iterations, and I think it's not the most catchy name, but it's not a bad name. Um, so sometimes I use a composition, try to sort of have a combination of two syllables to create a name that's suggestive. But I do think that actually the probably the a lot of people have been a lot more successful with Google. What does Google mean? It's kind of distinctive. People sort of remember it, and it doesn't really tell you what Google does. Microsoft, on the other hand, sort of tells you what people does, but they stumbled on it 5 years after they started. So anyway, I think a name is very hard, and it's very hard to come up with something meaningful. So, but you shouldn't sacrifice simplicity and catchiness for meaningful.
Just another question that follows up this question. Do you think that if we get a name now that we think is suitable, would it be okay to change it later after our platform is already out, or would that not be a good image of the startup?
Yeah, you can always, people do that all the time. I forgot what the original name of PayPal was, but it was pretty dorky. And 5 years later, they changed it to PayPal. So it's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
So thank you so much. I hope that all the questions are answered, and definitely I would say that maybe we could stay much longer and talk about startups and entrepreneurship and your personal experience. And we honestly, it will never be boring to us. So thank you so much for your valuable input, the insights, the also the great lose the eye inspiration. I hope that all our attendees will keep this in mind, because definitely the eye cannot make a successful startup. Do you have any closing word?
Well, first of all, thank you all for listening, and thank you for the questions. And sounds like you have a really great program. The only issue that I have that I've struggled with, talking to AUB students is that as empathetic as I would try to be, it's really hard for me to imagine the environment and the conditions that you guys have to operate in, and how a lot of these lessons that we talk about are certainly, applicable in America or applicable in the West. But I sometimes just, think about how much harder it would be if I was doing the same work in Lebanon. And so I have a lot of empathy, and I think it's difficult enough to be an entrepreneur under the best circumstances where you have all the support systems available to you. It's got to be so much harder given what people have to deal with. So you have my sympathy and admiration.
Don't
Thank
worry,
you
we
very
got
much.
this.
Yeah, and we hope that this context you're talking about actually gives more motivation, more determination to our students to pursue entrepreneurship no matter what, and to prove that, despite everything, we can be successful and hopeful, and we can be up to some unique businesses and actually make our dreams come true. So we always think that being in such a difficult context, I would say, sometimes could be a blessing if people would like to look at it that way. So thank you again so much for your time today. I believe that this recording should be up on YouTube in the next few days on the AUB Lebanon YouTube channel. Thanks again for LebNet for partnering with us and always bringing us top experts and the best speakers that we have in the North Americas. Thank you so much again, and have a good evening, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you, and good luck, everyone.
Thank you.